The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy. For decades, Clark Kent's history as Superboy, both in Smallville and the future with the Legion of Superheroes, was a cornerstone of the Superman mythology. Despite being erased from comics continuity twice, the concept of Clark as Superboy has endured in various ways across time and media. It also represents the largest unexplored piece of my Superman fandom. Until now. Welcome to the milestone 150th episode of Digging for Kryptonite. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is the start of a Superboy Fan Journey, a sprawling new podcast epic. And joining me to answer the question, must there be a Superboy? In studio, we have returning guest Rich Roney. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very eager for this conversation.
Yes, this is the kickoff to our huge new event. We will be covering the concept of Clark Kent as Superboy across time and media. This is the biggest event we've done so far, probably the biggest event we'll ever do on Digging for Kryptonite. I'm not revealing yet just how many episodes this will be, but we will be in Superboy territory for a while. And this is meant to be our kickoff episode to share our thoughts and experiences with this notion of Clark Kent as Superboy. And to pose a number of questions. They won't all be answered in this episode. I think a lot of them will fuel the conversations to come, but I think it's important to ask the questions and to start to unpack all of this. So I'm really excited. For people who have been following this podcast, listening to the episodes, and also following along on social media, I don't think this event is a surprise. I have been hinting at Superboy coverage for quite a while, and in fact, intended to do this much earlier in the game, like a year ago or more, but it just wasn't the right time. And one of the things that I've learned doing this podcast for 150 episodes now is that while I map out everything well in advance, and I have my Excel spreadsheet that I'm referencing all the time, that the show does kind of have a will of its own, which I know sounds kind of silly, but it sometimes lets me know where it wants to go. And this is the time for Superboy. My curiosity in this portion of the Superman mythology has never been higher. So this is the time to do it, and I'm so excited, and I'm really excited to have you here to help me kick this off.
No, thank you. I know in a week we're going to discuss some specific Silver Age stories. I'm in the process of reading those and rereading things I read when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old, but now I've got a completely different take on it. So I am very excited about this, and I think there's a lot of plot points and discussion points and elements of characterization we'll be able to analyze and take apart.
Yes, and if there's one word that I think is the theme of this episode, and maybe this entire event, it's tension. The tension that I have felt as a Superman fan towards the idea of Clark Kent operating as Superboy. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about. But first, like I said, this is our 150th episode. I'm honored to be here, to be doing this podcast. I enjoy it really more than I can put into words, honestly. It's such a joy to do. I found it endlessly fulfilling, and I'm actually kind of surprised that I'm still as excited and curious and enthusiastic this far in. But I think it speaks to a couple of things. Certainly the richness of the Superman mythology, that there's so much to mine over this now 86-year journey. And beyond that, the people. So on that note, I want to thank all of the guests who have come on, yourself included, who always come prepared and ready to play. And we have such a great back and forth. And having kind of our rotating stable of guests, it keeps everything fresh and exciting. And it's just always such a blast to sit down, whether it's in person or over Zoom, and have these conversations. So of course, my thanks to the guests, to our patrons who really show their support in a very tangible way. It makes a huge difference. It enables me to do this. So I really appreciate it. Our audience generally. And one of the things that I really want to say in particular is I'm especially grateful to the folks who really engage with the podcast. There are folks I hear from regularly, like on a weekly basis. And I don't want to name names because I don't want to run the risk of omitting anyone, but you guys know who you are. And For those who just listen and I never hear from, that's totally fine. And I have no expectation, and I appreciate you listening. But particularly to those folks who have reached out to say, I listened to the episode, I enjoyed it, I agreed with this, I didn't agree with that. You know, a lot of times they'll make recommendations of like, oh, I think you should read or watch this, you'll enjoy it. I appreciate all of it. And that level of engagement really helps sustain the enthusiasm that I have. So really, I am very, very grateful to all of those folks who've been so engaged with the podcast. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the creators whose work we discuss week in and week out. We discuss it, we analyze it, we have some fun with it sometimes, we nitpick it sometimes, but it's all with love. And this was really cool, Rich. I haven't shared this with you yet, but last week's episode, we covered the 2 Superman 78 comic book miniseries written by Robert Venditti. The first one was drawn by Wilfredo Torres. The second one was drawn by Gavin Guidry. And I did something unusual. When I posted the episode on Twitter, I tagged those 3 creators. Normally I don't, but this episode about Superman 78, it was such a love fest. We were, we really enjoyed them, and a lot of that was expressed in the episode. So I was like, I want them to know about this. And I tagged them. And Robert Venditti and Wilfredo Torres both listened to the episode and reached out, and it was great. And Robert in particular said that he enjoyed the conversation that Daniel, my guest, and I had, and that it was an honor for him that we were engaging with the material to that extent and thinking about it the way we did. So, I mean, that's a specific example of actually having that back and forth with creators. But just generally speaking, they're the ones who are creating all of this stuff for us to talk about. So I always want to express my gratitude to them as well.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
So, on this notion of Clark Kent operating as Superboy, I want to toss it to you first. We've talked about your first comic book experience, World's Finest, 143. So you met Superman, but do you remember the first time you encountered Superboy and what your impressions were?
That's a wild question.
It shouldn't be that shocking.
I do know as a child, there were a few 2 or 3 or 4 80-page giant annuals, and I'm sure I got those. I really did not buy a lot of Superboy comics per se, but I have tremendous fondness for Superman, the Silver Age Superman character, and that carried over to fondness for the Silver Age Superboy. But I'm very ambivalent about that. One thing that kind of irks me, in the Silver Age, whether it was a 2-year-old version of Superboy, a 14-year-old version, an 18-year-old iteration, or a 30-year-old, they all had the same power set. And I just, that never, I never cared for that. I mean, I remember reading different stories when Super Tot would have the same power set as a 30-year-old Superman. And I like much more of the modern renditions when Clark or Superboy, it would be more akin to normal human beings. You grow and you get more coordinated, you get stronger, you evolve on a physical and intellectual level. So the more modern versions are much more appealing to me. But I still have tremendous fondness for Superboy, the character, the Silver Age, because I grew up with that. I did read a number of 80-page giants that reprinted all these stories. I will say for me, there was a 20-issue run of Adventure Comics, Superboy and the Legion, that I consistently purchased almost every issue from 352 to 372. And some of that stands the test of time. I mean, I vividly remember one story where Superboy, and I'm thinking he might have been 17 or 18 years old, was going through survivor's guilt. I mean, there was a story when one of the heroes in the Legion had died, and he sacrificed himself to save the universe, but Superboy was going to do it first. This other character clocked him and knocked Superboy out. And then about 5 issues later, he was dealing with all this post-traumatic guilt. Like, did I let him knocked me out? Was I scared to do this myself? He died because of me. And even to this day, I can remember just being so impressed with that reflectiveness and that sense of guilt that Superboy felt as a teenager. I thought that was a very powerful moment. So I have tremendous fondness for the Silver Age Superboy character within really a set time period.
Understood. I want to circle back to the whole idea of the power level, because that's something that I think feeds into part of the tension that I felt. Not so much with the powers, but more just in terms of the personal growth and journey that the character can or can't go on in these kinds of stories. But these days, and I really want to talk about the publishing history of Superboy and how this entire chapter of the Superman mythology was removed from continuity with Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then was reintroduced with Infinite Crisis, and then fell by the wayside with the New 52, and then was reinstated once again with Doomsday Clock. So there are a lot of ebbs and flows, but still kind of big picture. You have Superboy as part of the Superman story for roughly 40 years, and then jettisoned with Crisis on Infinite Earths. And in the modern era, primarily, I think when we're talking about Superboy, I think most people would gravitate towards Connor Kent, a.k.a. Con-El, the clone of Superman and Lex Luthor, introduced during the reign of the Superman storyline following his death. And then even more recently, John Kent, the son of Lois and Clark, prior to his aging up and assuming and sharing the mantle of Superman with his father. I'm very curious, even though I know you didn't spend as much time with Superboy in the pre-Crisis era as you did with Superman. Nevertheless, you have that history. When I say Superboy, I mean, putting this episode aside because we're really focusing on Clark, but generally speaking, when I say Superboy, who immediately comes to your mind? Is it still Clark, or have Connor and or John kind of usurped that role in your head?
I'd have to say, well, there's appeal of all three. But probably for me, it's the Silver Age character that I grew up with. But I really like what they did with Connor. I liked John before they aged him up. I thought the Super Son stuff that Peter Tomasi did, I was so impressed with that. I would say those three characters are the ones that resonate with me. And I would say it's probably Clark, and then his son, John, as a young child, hanging out with Damian. And then probably third would be Connor. Just from a reading and a timing standpoint, I'm appreciative of Connor. I like what they did to give him his own identity, his own history. But I wasn't the demographic that they were writing for.
Fair enough. No, it's okay. I know you're looking at me apologetically as you're saying it. It's all right. I totally
Rich
get it.
Poker Face Roney.
For me, and I don't think anyone will be surprised by this, Connor's my guy. When I say Superboy, that's who I'm thinking of. And I know over the course of these episodes, I'm going to slip up at times. And, I'm always going to have to make sure I'm qualifying Clark as Superboy. And there are times I might say Superboy as a default referring to Connor, because that's my first real exposure to the concept of Superboy.
That makes perfect sense. Given your entry point to that makes tremendous sense.
Absolutely. And I've loved the character. I was brokenhearted when he was eliminated from continuity. I was pleased to see him return, even though he's now part of a very crowded Superman family, but at least he's back and he has a place. And the idea of, I think generally speaking, whether we're talking Clark or Connor or John or anyone else, especially when you factor in out of continuity, Elseworld stories and whatnot, the idea of a young person grappling with this level of power, I think is appealing, like at a very base level. So I think that just the concept of Superboy, putting aside who's bearing the mantle, I think the concept is inherently an appealing one. And I think with Connor, and certainly you get shades of this with John, no doubt, but with Connor, the idea that he is this clone of the guy and is living and operating under his shadow, right? And this notion of him maybe becoming Superman one day hanging over him, I think puts kind of an interesting spin on it. And yes, just given the time that I grew up and who I spent the most time with, I do always gravitate towards Connor. So that's really my first exposure to the concept of Superboy. But I was really thinking back, like, okay, when did it even occur to me that there was a period of time where Clark had been Superboy? Because yes, as the audience knows very well by this point, I'm 5 years old in 92 when the death of Superman hits. And so I grow up in the post-crisis era where he was never Superboy, right? He's Clark Kent, his powers develop, and he becomes Superman. And really there are three things that I've kind of circled back to with my experience with Clark as Superboy. So it's vague. It's a vague memory, but I remember being a little kid, and it's possible this was before the death of Superman. I mean, and if we factor in the time when the show originally aired, 88 to 92, that would make sense. I'm referring to the Superboy TV series. It's a vague memory, but I do have a memory of watching the opening credits, because I have this memory of Superboy flying over the bridge and the music. So it's a vague memory, but I remember being in the apartment that I lived in before we moved to the house that I would grow up in. And just and seeing that on the screen and hearing the music. So it's very vague, but there was at least some sort of connection point to that TV show, but very tenuous, very tenuous.
And I've never seen any of those episodes. I know you've spoken about them.
Oh, I will circle back to the Superboy TV show. Don't worry. I got a lot to say on that. Not so much for this episode. I won't subject you to that now, but there's a lot of coverage coming up that is going to pay off on what we're setting up in this episode here. And the Superboy TV show is a big part of that. And I will just share, as of this recording, I'm about halfway through my binge of the Superboy TV series. I've just entered into season 3. So more to come on that. And I might have a couple of other things to share a little bit later here. But so there's that vague memory. More specifically, there are 2 comic issues sitting on the table next to us here. So one of them is Superboy number 158 from 1969. And it's a very striking Neil Adams cover of Superboy finding his Kryptonian parents' bodies floating in this capsule in space. And I got a hold of this when we were visiting relatives in upstate New York in Rochester, and they had a bin of old comics. And for the life of me, I really can't remember what else was in there. Maybe there really wasn't anything else on the Superman front. There's one Superman issue that comes to mind. I'll have to see if I can find the issue. If I see the cover, I'll know it. But there was this issue of Superboy, and I took it home and I had it. And then during one of my collection purges, I got rid of it. And then now that I've been approaching this podcast event, I'm like, I really would want to have it. I tracked it down on eBay, and it was relatively inexpensive, and I'm happy to have a copy of it now. So that, I would say, was probably the first real instance of, there's this whole other thing. But I'm a little kid at this point. So I don't know that I would have even really had a sense of continuity changes or whatnot. I don't really know what I made of it, but I had that encounter. And then the last one, number 3, is The New Adventures of Superboy, issue number 1. So this was the Bronze Age series that launched in 1980, and it ran for 54 issues, leading up to essentially Crisis on Infinite Earths or thereabouts. And it's the cover where Superboy is celebrating his 16th birthday. So it's Superboy and the Smallville cast. There's a birthday cake in front of him, and it's happy 16th birthday. And I remember finding that in the back issue bins at the Dragon's Den comic book store in Yonkers, New York, not far from the comic book shop that you and I spent a lot of time at. But I remember seeing it in the back issue bin and buying it. Again, though, not really having much of a sense of what the deal was, right? So again, I'm talking 3 very vague, very tenuous encounters with this. But and it's interesting to talk about, because again, when I talk about Superman, it's so clear, it's so distinct. It sets me on a path that's continuing to this day. Superboy, very different, but did have these early encounters. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. With more than 40 years and a new second location to its name, Acme is a multiple-time Eisner Award nominee. The shop features a significant contemporary and vintage selection, as the Acme team uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw Yeah. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page.
I did read somewhere where he was the 6th character to be given his own solo title, right? I mean, my God, talk about the mythos of Superman and the power of the character. And to go a step further, I mean, there was a 20-year time span when Superboy was the title character in 2 ongoing publications, Adventure Comics and Superboy. So I think it's a testimony to the mythos and the popularity of Superman, but also, look, those guys were in business to make money, and nothing succeeds like success. So if Superman's making money with newspaper strips and radio adventures, let's start publishing this.
So I'm glad you brought up the publication history and the starting point for this. I want to delve a little bit more into that. But I think this is as good a point as any to kind of lay out, I don't want to say pros and cons, but sort of the 2 sides of this tension that I've experienced. And let me say, I'm sure there are people listening to this who either they might love the idea of Clark as Superboy, or on the other hand, they might just think it's stupid, or they might be totally indifferent. It's like, oh yeah, either he's Superboy or he's not, whatever. And you might be wondering, like, what's the big deal? Like, why spend so much time on this? Why wrestle with it in this way? But I guess to that, I would say, are you new here? Like, this is what we do. But also, going back to this idea, it's 150 episodes we've been doing this. And in almost every instance, whenever we've spent time with something and really dug in, I've come away with a greater appreciation for either a specific story or era or element or whatever it might be. And there's no rule saying I have to love every aspect of Superman. But where and when that's possible, I want to take that opportunity. So that's why, I want to wrestle with this idea and kind of challenge the notions that I've had about Clark operating as Superboy and see where I land. And I might land in exactly the same spot, or I might feel completely differently. And wherever it lands, it's a valuable process for me personally, and hopefully for the audience as well. But when we talk about this tension, on the one hand, and the reason why I think I've really always butted up against this idea of Clark operating as Superboy, I mean, first and foremost, the time that I grew up. So the post-crisis Triangle era comics that I grew up reading, as well as the other media adaptations that I experienced, both pre and post-crisis, with limited exceptions, including most notably the Superboy TV show. But most other media adaptations and the comics I grew up reading did not include the Superboy chapter in Clark's journey. Rather, and this is an important point for me, becoming Superman in a lot of those stories was this graduation level threshold moment. It's a big deal when he dons that costume and becomes a costumed public-facing superhero. And I know I've said this in many episodes along the way. It's hard for me to look at Clark as Superboy and not feel like it undermines his journey. And even if I can get over myself with this whole idea of this graduation level moment, beyond that, and this goes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the power level, right? Hand in hand with that is the personal development. And I think not surprisingly, right, the Smallville TV series was so formative for me. And those of us who love the show will be the first to admit it could be a frustrating watch at times where you want the character to figure it out. And sometimes the character would take one step forward and two steps back. Then it could be a little frustrating at times. But I think that one of the biggest reasons why I still love that show so much, and many of my fellow fans do as well, and why it lasted a decade. Most Superman shows, we're talking like 4 seasons. I ran the numbers recently. That's a pretty common number for a lot of Superman shows. Why it ran 10 seasons was because there was a journey, a personal journey of development for this character to go on. That period of the character's history, I think, is ripe for that kind of story and that kind of exploration. And if you put him in a costume and you have him be so self-assured and confident and capable and essentially operating the same way he will as Superman, I can't help but feel like it short circuits the process, or at least eliminates the possibility for that kind of personal exploration. And then the last thing on this side of the tension, this is relatively minor. This is not the hill I'm going to die on. But when we talk about suspension of disbelief, it's one thing that people can't figure out that Clark is Superman. It's a trope of the story. We can get on board with it. There are various stories that have, I think, done a good job of accounting for all the things Clark is doing that might throw people off. All of that, totally fine. But when you now factor in the Superboy piece, that Superboy is operating in Smallville with Clark, and then they both move over to Metropolis at the same time, I think it requires an even greater suspension of disbelief. And I feel like we're really stretching it now. So on the one hand, that's kind of part of why I've always had a problem with this. Curious what jumps out at you.
You got to harken back a little bit to what Siegel envisioned. I mean, a lot of this was wish fulfillment, right? He was not recognized. He was shunned, or it was de minimis. Girls didn't look at him. So this was wish fulfillment. Like, hey, if they could just see me the way I really am, I am a strong person.
When you speak about Siegel, that kind of takes us over to the other side of the equation and the kind of creator's intent argument for Clark as Superboy. And I do want to spend some time on that. 2 other things, though, that I want to mention. Number one, lest anyone think that I don't want Clark performing any heroics before he's Superman. That's not the case. I really want to be clear here. The idea that young Clark Kent, regardless of what power level we're talking about, but he has abilities, to go back to Smallville. The fact that he couldn't help but use them to aid others makes all the sense in the world. And I'm very much on board with that. And that's the core tenet of the Smallville TV series, right? That he's helping people, but he's not wearing a costume and he's doing it in secret. So I do want to be clear about that. It's really, when I talk about what I struggle with, it's really this whole costumed, named idea. So that's one thing. The other thing, I mentioned Smallville, and we'll be mentioning Smallville a lot over these episodes. And also, if anyone has been saying to themselves, Anthony clearly loves Smallville, he talks about it all the time, he's only done a few episodes about it on the podcast here and then, are you ever going to do like a Smallville event? Well, just you stay tuned. Stay tuned. We got cooking up something really, really fun. I'm excited to get into it. And we've lined up, I think, the best people to talk Smallville with. They've all been on the show before. So some fun, familiar voices, and we're going to be getting into it. And I'm very, very excited. So just stay tuned. I know that your experience with the Smallville show is minimal. I know that weirdly, not weirdly, because I know why, you own, out of the 10 seasons, you own season 9.
Correct.
Because that's what introduced the Justice Society. And I know you've watched those couple of episodes, and I know you've caught episodes here and there, and certainly you've heard me talk about it and other guys at the comic shop talk about it. So I know you know what it is. And I'm curious, and I actually think you're a really good person to ask about this, because I can speak to it from the perspective of someone who watched it religiously. I want to hear from someone was kind of more casually aware of it, but also who has the history with Superboy that you have. Do you, or did you, consider Smallville a Superboy show or Superboy story in any way?
That's an interesting question. Because it gets to the heart of, do I look at Clark and Superboy as 2 separate characters? I will say the premise and the construct of Clark not having the full power set that he would, say, at 32 years old. I liked it that he was evolving, both emotionally, intellectually, and in terms of his superpowers. I was very impressed with that. And I thought that was a very astute and intriguing move. I thought it would capture the viewer. So I was impressed. I thought that was a wise move.
Yeah. But I guess I don't know if you even remember when you first heard about the show, or either the first time you heard about it or first time you watched it or whatever, or you heard us talking about it. Like in your head, were you like, oh, like it's Superboy, or no?
Oh, I did think it was Superboy. To me, Clark and Superboy, when you recommended it to me, you said, look, there's no costume. So I already knew the square one premise. And I was cool with that. Okay, it's him as a teenager in high school. He hasn't yet become Superman. But he's like, I think to their credit, from what you guys said, they built it around the angst of high school and people maturing and growing. And I thought that was appropriate and cute and well done.
Totally. So this might be surprising to you or to audience members. I never, and even now, I still really don't view Smallville as a Superboy show or Superboy story. And again, that might sound odd. It certainly obviously utilizes the Smallville setting and the Smallville cast of characters and takes aspects of those Superboy stories, like Clark and Lex having a past together in Smallville, and spinning it into something far more involved and far deeper and more personal and more nuanced and all of that. But still, the kernel of it seems to be in these stories. So it seems to be drawing this inspiration. It taps into that pre-Superman time in his life. But of course, he's not wearing a costume or calling himself Superboy. I think the reason I never thought of it as a Superboy show was because I had next to no experience with Clark as Superboy. The show comes out in 2001. I'm reading comics for less than a decade at this point. It's not like I've immersed myself in that chapter of the pre-crisis history. So I think that's part of the reason why. Like, it wouldn't have even really occurred to me.
So for me, the reason I consider him Superboy is he's Superman as a teenager. And so I just backed it up.
Yeah. But then the other thing, too, goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about how this show is all about that journey and the personal struggle and what he had to overcome to be the hero that we know he'll be. And now, having learned more about pre-crisis Superboy, at least so far, and I still have a lot more to explore, but I'm not really seeing that. So I think there are a couple of things, yes, on the superficial level, the costume, the name, but on a deeper level, that personal journey that to me really make this distinct from, quote unquote, just being a Superboy story. Now, at the same time, again, it draws on so much from the Superboy lore. And on that note, so now I've laid out all the problems that I've had with Clark as Superboy. But on the other hand, and ultimately I think why we're here, the Superboy lore is so additive to the mythology. When we tally up everything that Superboy stories gave us, the Smallville setting, the role of the Kents, right? They had been introduced, but this gives them a larger role eventually. Lana Lang, Pete Ross, the Legion of Superheroes, Krypto, Bizarro, Red Kryptonite, White Kryptonite, Gold Kryptonite, Lex as this childhood friend, briefly, Mon-El, the Phantom Zone, General Zod. It's so additive, and so much of that lent itself to the Smallville show, which is one of the pillars of my fandom. And so even if I never come all the way around to loving the idea of Clark as Superboy, I cannot help but be appreciative of what it added to the mythology. And to be honest, when I started this podcast, I would say I was fairly ignorant of a lot of what I just laid out here. So that's why it's been so educational and insightful to kind of get this knowledge. So it adds so much to the mythology. It also, in fairness, we talked about how it stretches the suspension of disbelief that Clark is Superboy. At the same time, it does help account for how experienced and trusted he is as Superman. Like, he's had all of these experiences, right, as a kid. So I think there's some value in that.
For me, and I didn't think about it till you just went through that inventory, But more than anything else, it emphasizes the value of the Kents and how they helped instill moral values in him and their guidance and their role and how that was formative for his personality as Superman. The value of the Kents resonates the most with me.
Okay, now, but this is an important point. When does that happen in the comics? Like, are there specific instances that kind of come to mind in the Silver Age stories of this with the Kents?
There are some where it was more prevalent in the modern era, say the late 90s, the early 2000s. But I do remember reading some stories where Jonathan would, as a father, would give guidance to, the Kurt Swan or the Edmund Hamilton version of Superboy. It wasn't as instructive or the guidance that you would see in the more modern era, but it was still there.
Okay, so fair enough. No, I bring this up because one of those issues that I referenced is that New Adventures of Superboy Bronze Age story, and we're going to be covering that on the podcast. And there was a Twitter exchange recently between fellow podcasters Michael Bailey from Crisis to Crisis, a Superman podcast, and John Wilson from John Reads Comics. And John will actually be joining me for one of the episodes on New Adventures of Superboy. And he was posting about the issues that he's rereading in preparation for it, and specifically brought up, and he and Michael had a great back and forth about this, about how that kind of role, that nurturing role, instilling the values, that enhanced role for the Kents largely comes in that leg of the journey here. Again, I'm not saying like there's none of that. And clearly if you have specific instances that you recall, from those Silver Age stories, I don't want to take away from that. But I think maybe there's a fair argument to make that what we now have come to think of when we think of the Kents and their role in this maybe comes later in the game. When we're really talking about the heart of it, maybe comes like later in the game than we typically think. But yes, that's definitely, it eventually comes and is a key piece of this.
I agree.
Now, another kind of argument for Clark as Superboy is, I think, the history of it. The fact that it was such a large part of the character's mythology for decades, and that it was something that Jerry Siegel, co-creator of the character, wanted as early as 1938. And I want to kind of lay out a little bit of the how we got here. But beyond that, just kind of this creator's intent argument. I mean, I don't know, how compelling do you find that? Like the fact that one of the guys who created the character, like wanted there to be a Superboy. Does that sway you? Does that add more validity to the concept of Superboy for you? Because I don't know that I find that argument that compelling, but it's interesting. How do you feel?
I really don't have a horse in that race. I guess I'm leaning again, and it's reiterative to what I said a little bit earlier. Even though I didn't watch it, I land on the side of what they did with Smallville. I mean, there are some, and I do remember some odd stories here and there with my reading of Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, where he had conflict with another character. This never took place in the Justice League. So I thought one of the great things about that era of the mid-'60s to maybe 69 or 70 was when Jim Shooter was writing all these stories. There was a little bit of friction with other characters in the Legion. I think that's representative of real life. But it showed another side to Superboy where he had to be reflective, or he had to think about their motives, or he had to compromise.
I guess a couple of things. One, yes, the Legion piece of it adds this whole other dimension, because when we talk about Superboy stories, there really are these two distinct avenues. There are the Smallville set stories, and then there are the stories in the far future with the Legion of Superheroes, where he's part of this team. So that's a whole other dynamic. So going back to the origin of all of this. So Jerry Siegel pitches Superboy in 1938. That's the year that Superman debuted.
I didn't know that.
So as early as 1938, he pitches it, and it's rejected. 2 years later, in 1940, Siegel submits a completed script. And DC does not get back to him within the 6 weeks that were prescribed in the contract. Yet they do create an ash can of a Superboy comic. So yes, we'll get into at least we'll touch on the legalities of all of this. Cut ahead to the end of 1944. So it was November 18th, 1944, that More Fun Comics number 101 is published. That's the origin of Superboy, cover dated 1945. And they use that Siegel script reworked by writer Don Cameron. And Joe Shuster draws it, and he writes a letter to Siegel, who's in the military overseas at this point, saying, hey, they had me draw this comic from your script. So in 1947, Siegel and Shuster sue over the rights to both Superman and Superboy. And really, the legal aspect of this could be its own episode, and maybe I'll do it at some point. I don't know. But big picture, the court finds that DC owns Superman, but they find that Siegel owns Superboy because the court finds, this is interesting, that Superboy is a distinct entity, not derivative of Superman. And I might go so far as to try to dig up this opinion, because I would be curious if the judge actually, if the opinion gets into the why of it, or if it's just kind of more of the surface level. No, he's not a derivative character. Because I would be really curious what that analysis would look like, because that feels like a stretch to me. I don't know how that feels to you.
No, this is completely new information, new knowledge to me. I did hear at one time, at one of those iterations, Siegel wanted Superboy to be a prankster.
Yeah, I think that was the very original idea, I believe. I could be mistaken on that. But yeah, like he's a little scamp, like playing pranks.
Yeah.
Thankfully, they didn't stay on that track. But so the court finds that Siegel owns Superboy, but both Siegel and Shuster settle with DC over the rights to both Superman and Superboy for $100,000 at this point, despite this judgment awarding Siegel ownership of Superboy.
And what year was that?
47.
$100,000 in 47 is...
It's true, but still. And the legal battles obviously didn't stop there. I think people are familiar that in recent years, these battles continued and were renewed. There were battles, especially when we get to the point of the Siegel and Shuster estates. There were battles over the renewal of the copyright and the termination of the grant of copyright. So we're really be getting a bit in the weeds here. But suffice it to say that the legal battles have continued, and that led to what I think a lot of fans kind of picked up on from about 2004 on, where you really kind of saw this move away from the use of Superboy. This is when, Connor Kent was killed off in Infinite Crisis. And again, whether and to what extent the legalities of all this played into it, I don't know, and I can't say for sure. But there was this stretch where, clearly DC was trying to avoid using Superboy.
Interesting.
But in any event, that's kind of a little bit of the background here. But as far as the history, and again, this is, I think, one of the other arguments for Superboy, is just how substantial a chapter in the character's history was. I mean, introduced in late 44, right? Really just a few years, half a dozen years into the character's history.
6 years, right?
And originally appears in More Fun Comics numbers 101 through 107, then moves over to Adventure Comics starting with issue 103. The Legion is introduced in 1958 with Adventure Comics 247, and they eventually come to dominate that title. The Superboy solo series launches in 1949. You mentioned this earlier, only the sixth DC character to get his own title.
Correct.
Right, so Superman, yes. Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, and Green Lantern.
Yeah, and then he was number 6.
And the first one to launch post-World War II.
By himself, he had 2 concurrent titles. 2. I mean, Adventure and Superboy. And
yeah.
For 20 years, he had 2 titles that were published in parallel.
Yeah. Now, and what's becoming a theme here, the Legion eventually pushes him out of this title, right? It becomes Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes with issue 222. That's officially changed with issue 231. And then Superboy leaves in issue 258. And from 259 forward, it's just Legion of Superheroes. So another book that he gets crowded out of. But then we get to this Bronze Age series that I've been referencing, The New Adventures of Superboy, which runs for 54 issues from 80 to 84. Then there's a 4-issue miniseries called Superman: The Secret Years in 1985. I don't know if you've ever read that or are aware of it. We're going to be covering it on this event.
I've heard of it. Is that his college years? Is that between Smallville and Arrival in Metropolis?
Yeah, it's meant to be a bit of a bridge between Superboy and Superman. It has covers by Frank Miller, which might be the most notable aspect.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that.
Who's the interior artist?
I'd have to double check. I don't know offhand. And then we have Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? And following Crisis, now Superboy is no longer a part of Clark's history until you get to Infinite Crisis and the creation of this new Earth with its revised continuity. And now, once again, that is a part of Clark's past. And I think that the reintroduction of that, I think, I don't know, we'd probably still be doing this run of episodes either way, but the reintroduction of Clark as Superboy post Infinite Crisis, I think really kind of added some fuel to the fire for me, because now it's back, and yet not much is really done with it in the nearly 20 years since that's happened, right? So in Infinite Crisis, when you see the new Earth created, you see these kind of like shards of the new continuity, and you see Superboy standing in front of the Smallville sign, and it's like, okay, this is back. And Jeff Johns, to his credit, does work with this in his Legion trilogy, right? The Lightning Saga, that crossover between Justice League and Justice Society, the Superman and the Legion of Superheroes storyline from Action Comics, and Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds.
Interesting.
We're going to be talking about all of that on the podcast. So Johns at least does something with that, and especially with this, not just that Superboy is reinstated, but his experience with the Legion of Superheroes, right? So Johns does do work with that, but then come the New 52, Superboy's out of the picture again. And Johns does reinstate that history as Superboy in Doomsday Clock and makes it like critical to the future of, to the direction of Clark's life and the direction of the DCU, right? And of course, that ties back to your favorite character, Alan Scott, right? The fact that if Alan Scott doesn't become Green Lantern and we don't have the Justice Society, Clark never becomes Superboy, right? And his kind of life goes down one road. But now with the restored timeline, he's Superboy. He saves his parents. That ends up being the critical difference. Because he's Superboy, he's there. He's able to save Jonathan and Martha. They're alive in the present. So it became kind of this fulcrum point. Yet, still, other than what Johns has done in that Legion trilogy and Doomsday Clock, to my knowledge, and correct me, or audience correct me, not much has really been done with this in this modern era.
I'm not the guy to ask. I mean, my intensity of enjoyment in reading comics is not what it once was. So some of this stuff, there's been so much change. I'm not the guy to keep current.
Yeah, that's okay, Rich. But all to say that, again, it has been a huge part of the character, and then it wasn't, and now it's back, albeit not, I don't know, not really kind of explored to the extent that maybe it could or should be or shouldn't be. I mean, I don't know. I think that's kind of an open question. And this is where I kind of go back and forth a little bit, because you have a guy like Jeff Johns. You also have Mark Waid, who has talked on this podcast about how he would have had Clark be Superboy in Birthright if he weren't constrained by the continuity of the time.
Yeah.
Now, I think it'd be easy to be like, well, Johns and Waid, like they love Superboy from when they were kids, and that's why they want to use it. But I don't know. I feel like that's a little bit dismissive or reductive. You and I both big fans of both of those writers and have read so much of their work over the years. And like that kind of, it makes me think about it more. Like the fact that these two guys whose work I've admired and respected, like they see some value in this. So again, it at least makes me want to take another look at it. But again, the counterpoint to that is others maybe don't necessarily feel the same way, right? Like again, the fact that not much has been done with this, I don't know what that says. Maybe it says nothing, but it's just something that I kind of kick around. You know, maybe this is a question that you will have a take on, which is, we're talking about the comic side, right? But then there are these other media adaptations. And when we talk about the ones that followed Superboy's introduction in the mid-40s, the Kirk Allen movie serials, your beloved George Reeves' Adventures of Superman series, the iconic Christopher Reeve movie series. So those three in particular, because we're not even into post-crisis territory yet, where you wouldn't really expect to see Superboy, but specifically in those pre-crisis adaptations, none of them use Superboy. Now, Superboy does appear in the Filmation animated world. There are segments.
Oh, in the 1960s, I do remember.
Yeah, there were some Superboy segments. Superboy also pops up in a couple of episodes of Super Friends, like in flashbacks or time travel. So the animated world, certainly acknowledged Superboy. And then, yes, of course, we will get the Superboy TV series from 88 to 92. Although, ironically, comes right after the character has been erased from continuity in Crisis. But again, my question to you is with those pre-Crisis adaptations that followed Superboy's introduction in the comics, like all of them choose not to use Superboy.
That seems to me very, very common sense, right? You had the Kirk Allen serials. You had the show that I loved. And then you had Christopher Reeve's movies in the late 70s, perhaps early 80s, prior to Crisis. You're obviously going to go with Superman. He's more well-known, more popular. You can do more with him. So I think probably from a financial investment standpoint, from a popularity standpoint, from doing something that was going to pull people into the theaters or get them in front of the TV, I think they obviously would have gone with Superman as a character because it's a bigger splash in the pond.
Yeah, no, and also I'm not saying that I don't necessarily think any of those stories would have been better served by inserting Superboy. I'm not. That's not the argument but I'm just, again, it's more like what does it say something about the validity or lack thereof of the Superboy concept if these other major media adaptations just skip over it? I don't know. And maybe the answer is no. It doesn't really say anything. It just is what it is. And maybe there was this feeling among those who were involved with those projects or and maybe even fans as well. Like, actually, this is a good question for you. I mean, because this is what I get tripped up on. Viewing Superboy as part of the Superman story. For you, like, did you look at it more as like, really they're a separate character? Or in your head, was it always like, okay, no, this really is the adventures of Superman when he's a boy? Like, how did you view it?
Definitely more the latter. I mean, I was very conscious of the fact that when I was reading one of those 80-page giants, or I was reading an Adventure Comics, or even the few issues of Superboy itself that I purchased, I was conscious that this is the teenage version of Superman, right? So I didn't view them as separate characters. That's how I looked at it.
Sure. Oh, and then we've been talking about the Kents. They have a very minimal role in the beginning here, but their names specifically, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we know from Superman #1, Mary is named, but Pa is not. By Superman #53, the telling of the origin on the 10-year anniversary, they're named John and Mary. John becomes Jonathan in Adventure Comics 149. And in Superboy #12, Ma is named, or I guess renamed, Martha with an E at the end. Martha? I don't know, but not Martha. And then eventually, I think a few issues later, it would become Martha. So you have that evolution there too. And I just can't help myself because you imagine how that scene in Batman v Superman would have played out if he was like, save Martha. He's like, what did you say? Did you say Martha? No, Martha
Mary.
with an E. Oh, okay. Stabs him with the spear. So thankfully it was changed to Martha. So now I know you said, you've never seen the Superboy TV series from 88 to 92. You know of it though, like the initial premise that they're at Schuster University in Florida.
You told me, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
In any event, we'll be covering that. I'm, like I said, a little more than halfway through my binge. And all I'll say right now as a tease is that, how do I put this? I think the show's limitations from a narrative and technical standpoint are apparent. However, there is a charm and an appeal to the show. And I love Smallville endlessly. But one of the things you really kind of have to buy into with Smallville is this idea of restraint, right? We're building towards something. I think that's very valuable. That resonated with me. But I know fans at times, and maybe even myself at certain instances, got a little frustrated waiting. With this Superboy TV show, it is wholeheartedly, unabashedly, a full-on comic book inspired Superboy show. And there's something to be said for that. And they draw a lot from the comics where they can. And I would say their Bizarro episodes are amazing. It's
interesting.
Like, so far, those have been far and away, I think, the strongest episodes. And I would go so far as to say the best adaptation of Bizarro that we've gotten in anything. So, and I was like just too young when that show was airing because it was aired from 88 to 92. I was born in 87. If I had been a few years older, I think I would have a whole different take on it. Like if I were watching that and I had been, 5, 6, 7, I think I would feel very differently and really have like a lot of love for it.
I agree. There's something about your entry point and what you're first exposed to and what you first absorb.
Last couple of questions for you, and then we'll toss it to this golden age segment that we have here. But this is another big picture question, one that we'll answer when we get to the crisis chapter of all of this. But do you think that DC made a misstep in completely eliminating Superboy post-crisis? Especially as it pertains to Legion continuity, because like Legion falls apart after that. And I know there's a Band-Aid attempt with a storyline post-crisis called The Greatest Hero of Them All. It's the post-crisis or the Pocket Universe Superboy. Like they try to kind of plug that hole. But I don't know. Like, do you think it was the right call to just eliminate it as opposed to reduce it or restrict it or limit it in some way?
That's interesting. My recollection is that in the 1960s, when I read stuff, Superboy was clearly the motivation for the Legion to be formed. They were inspired by his actions as a teenager, and it was kind of a fan club, right? I think post-crisis, it was positioned more as, even though Superboy wasn't a participant, our admiration for Superman was the basis of why we came together. I was okay with that. I do think at the same time, just about the time you started entering comics and reading, Monel he was Valor for a while. And I think they played him up more as the Superboy character or the powerhouse in the Legion.
Yeah, Monel was definitely kind of filled in there. Again, it might sound weird, and I'm not even going so far as to say like they should have kept Superboy. Right. Again, I love the era of comics that I grew up in, and I'm not, again, I wouldn't go so far as to say, yeah, they definitely made a mistake. But now having more of an appreciation, and I do have an appreciation. I mean, I've done the reading for the episode that we're doing next week on Silver Age Superboy. And spoiler alert for that episode, I had a lot of fun with those issues in much the same way that I've had fun with the Silver Age Superman stories that we've looked at. So and like I said, I'm deep into my Superboy TV series binge, like my appreciation for all this is already growing. And I just say to myself, it was an awfully drastic step to take with such a large part of the Superman mythology. And we'll unpack this as we get further along, but I just wonder, would it not have been possible to maybe make it that Clark never wore the costume in Smallville, but he had it and he helped people and he wore the costume when he went to the future with the Legion?
That's intriguing. As you were saying all this, I wonder if they could have done something after Byrne, redid the character and set, got all the rust and the barnacles off and came back to basics. Could they have done something with a teenage version, perhaps less powerful version, in a different costume in the future? I think that might have been intriguing, and that might have been more like, hey, this is a different environment. It's going to condition me or give me exposure to other superpowered beings, both good and bad. That may have been a way to go. I mean, I'd really need to think about that a little bit. I think it's a disservice to go, well, I'll wear the exact same costume as a 17-year-old, only in the future. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah, it's just interesting. Again, I totally get overall that the instinct to remove it. I do get it. I think it did serve the character well. It was part of the basis of the version that I loved. But I don't know. At the same time, now seeing what a big part Superboy was in all of this, I can't help but wonder if there was some sort of middle ground as opposed to just jettisoning it completely.
Absolute jettisoning.
The last thing, not even so much a question, but just kind of, I think a realization that I'm having is that we talked about that Secret Years miniseries. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've skimmed through it and I skimmed through the final chapter, and I don't want to jump the gun with a discussion of that because we're gonna cover it. But essentially, in the final issue, there's a battle with Lex, and he calls him Superboy, and he's like, it's Superman now. And I have to read the whole miniseries. Maybe it'll have greater impact in context. I just really read it in a vacuum, but I don't know that really does for me what I need it to. And I think I think the missing piece for me to really accepting Clark as Superboy is some kind of bridge connecting Superboy to Superman. Some kind of story that is able to tap into the feeling that we get in the modern stories where there's no Superboy and it's this graduation level moment where he becomes Superman. Is there a way to have that kind of story where Superboy is still part of his journey, but it still feels momentous when he becomes Superman? And does that mean that maybe Superboy's costume is a little bit different and there's some kind of like a visual shift or just some kind of moment where, the change officially takes place, but you feel the weight of it. I don't know. We have Mark Waid in his World's Finest corner of the DC universe and doing such great work, hearkening back to the stories of your youth and that I've really grown to love, but putting a modern, fresh spin on them. We know he has a lot of affection for Superboy.
You said that so well about a minute ago. Is there a profound moment when you see that, that delta, that change, and now he is Superman, right? Even as at the very start of this, I told you I didn't like him having the same power set from a 2-year-old to a 30-year-old. I didn't like him having the same costume all the time. It didn't show any differentiation. If in my most perfect world, I probably would have done kind of the Byrne version, but a teenager who could collaborate with the Legion, but I have him in a different costume and have him a reduced power set. I don't know what that costume would be. You're walking a fine line between leveraging the prominence of the S. Maybe it's without a cape and a different color scheme or something like that, or the black and silver type of color scheme.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen proto versions of the Superman costume when Grant Morrison did that New 52 run on Action Comics, and you had the white T-shirt,
the
and
little
cape.
Abner costume.
Yeah, so I think there are ways, but I bring up Mark Waid because again, he's got this whole little corner of the DC universe. He's got this love for Superboy. I feel like if someone were to really do something, like he'd be the guy, and I feel like there's storytelling potential here. Only in the first episode of this, I've already become a little bit of a convert on the Superboy of it all, as I like to say. But yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to be doing this. I think there's a lot to talk about. We're going to have a lot of fun with these episodes. And I thank you for joining me to help kick this off.
I was thrilled. I enjoyed it, every bit of it.
So don't go anywhere. Right after this break, Tyler Patrick from the Krypton Report podcast will join me and we will discuss Superboy in the golden age of comics. We'll be right back. I'm a proud backer of the Paragons of Earth comic book project, now available to support on Kickstarter. The creative team of Percival Constantine, Thomas DJ, and Eric Johns have plucked forgotten Golden Age superheroes from the public domain, reinvented them as their own sort of Justice League, and put them up against a Lovecraftian apocalypse. Back this project and learn more by going to percivalconstantine.com/paragons. Also, Perry, a multiple-time guest on Digging for Kryptonite, hosts the Superhero Cinephiles podcast about comic book-inspired films. Be sure to listen wherever you get podcasts. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZLComics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Joining me to discuss Superboy in the golden age of comics is the host of the Krypton Report podcast, returning guest Tyler Patrick. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be here, especially talking about Superboy, because it's a fun topic that I'm still trying to teach my kids about. Because they always are like, "That's not Superboy," and I'm like, "Yeah, it is at this time, kids. Let me go back and try to explain this again."
There is a lot to unpack there. Yeah, how do you approach that with your kids in terms of trying to lay out how this fits into the mythology?
It's kind of it's funny because it's a twofold conversation sometimes, because I've been watching the Superboy TV series. I had gotten the rest of the discs for my birthday in February, and I've been going through seasons 3 and 4, and they'll watch with me. Solomon will watch with me, and he'll be, at first, he's finally good now, but Sayla still says something because she'll be like, he's not a boy, Dad. I know. Okay. Like, just, they're like, he's a man. I know, kids. Okay. They're like, so when I explain it to him, it's like, these were adventures of Clark Kent as Superboy. And then later they reboot the story, and he wasn't Superboy. He didn't become Superman until he was older. And then we got a different character of Superboy. And they're like, okay. Because they understand like the concept because of movies of reboots and stuff. So I'm just like, yeah, they just rebooted it. Okay.
That's true. These days, I think people, kids and adults, have more than a familiarity with reboots, with multiverses. So that, I think, makes a smoother path perhaps for explaining some of this.
I mean, it does. It helps.
Right on. So you and I looked at a quartet of Golden Age Superboy stories. We looked at More Fun Comics number 101 from late 1944. That gave us the origin of Superboy. We also took a look at Adventure Comics number 120 from 1947, a story entitled Perry White, Cub Reporter. Then we have Superboy number 10 from 1950, The Girl in Superboy's Life, which introduces Lana Lang. And finally, from Adventure Comics number 210, in 1955, The Super Dog from Krypton, aka the debut of Krypto. So we'll talk about each of these stories individually, but generally speaking, your impressions of this representation of Superboy and the Golden Age?
I think just because I grew up with Superman the movie and, Smallville, I like that concept better than Clark Kent as a boy being super and doing things. And I think now I can go back and read them with more appreciation and enjoy, because there's a lot more world building to the character done in Superboy than there was done in Superman, especially from the Smallville angle, the characters, the Kents, all that is done through the Superboy comic than it was in Superman. So I have much greater appreciation for these stories now than I would have even 10, 15 years ago.
And that's what I have said, and I will continue to say over the course of this saga that we are currently embarking on with this podcast, where it is a tremendously additive portion of the mythology. It's one that I have struggled with and continue to wrestle with a bit, but I can't do anything but appreciate what it contributed to the mythology. And we see some of the building blocks of this here. I would say that I had a few key takeaways, things that I was actually kind of surprised by, to be honest. And this pertains especially to the earliest stories. And by that, I'm referring specifically to More Fun Comics 101, The Origin, and then that Perry White Cub Reporter story from 1947. I also read, I didn't ask you to do this, so no pressure on this, but I did also take a look at a number of those other early stories that are collected in the Adventures of Superboy hardcover that was released in 2010 and is now long out of print, but I was fortunate enough to nab a copy on eBay a few years ago when I started this podcast. And that collects Superboy's earliest appearances from More Fun Comics 101 through 107, and then Adventure Comics 103 through 121. But as far as those takeaways that I had, number one, I was struck by, especially in those early stories, just how young Superboy was at the beginning. In one of these early stories in that hardcover, he celebrates his 10th birthday. So it's one of those things when we think about Superboy, I don't know about you, but I always think about him as a teen. So this is a very, very young iteration of the character.
Yeah, I'm looking at that, and Solomon's 9, and I'm like, dear Lord, I couldn't see him doing this stuff. Like I love the kid, but he's so sometimes unaware of like spatially and just little stuff that like he's oblivious to, that you're just look at him like, you're just like, kid, but so I'm picturing Solomon as super. Yeah, be some.
Well, and that's the thing. And I don't mean to keep picking at this because, like I said, part of my aim with this event is to learn to love the idea of Clark as Superboy, or at least gain a better understanding and appreciation for it. One of the things, though, that I do continue to have a problem with just is this idea that he's got it all figured out as Superboy. And it's one thing to have to accept that when he's in his teen years, but it's a really big leap to imagine a 10-year-old boy
Yeah.
in that position.
I think it's just, I think our modern sense of storytelling, like even in our movies, like you go back and you watch movies from 10 years ago or, 20 years ago, and you're kind of like, you could have done this more, or given us more to the depth to the story of why this is happening. And I think, with these Superboy stories, there might have been that need. I don't know, that Siegel wanted to tell more of the Smallville story, the history of the character. Well, no one's going to, really read a comic of Clark as a kid with, no suit or anything. So we'll just make him Superboy, and we'll sell it to a younger audience. We'll make him more younger stories. And I'm like, okay, I can see that rationale, that because like we have a love for the Kents in those stories, but in Superman, the Kents are dead by the second panel or third panel. Like we'll get into it a little bit more because I got a little nitpick here. But they're killed off, and it's just interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the young age of Superboy, especially at the outset, was striking. Number two was how so many of the trappings that we typically associate with the Superboy story aren't there, or at least aren't there at the beginning. Smallville won't actually be named as Superboy's hometown until Superboy number 2 in 1949. And these earliest stories that we look at, either it's not named, or in one of the early ones, it seemingly Metropolis, because Superboy goes to the Metropolis chief of police and brings him to the neighborhood to speak to the residents. Not only that, you mentioned the Kents. Yes, the Kents are there from the outset, but they're not named, again, at least not initially. And they have a very minimal role. These are not stories about the Kents raising Superboy, or even about Superboy being parented by this kindly couple who found him. They're there, but again, their role is very minimal. He's really a kid who's got, like I said, got it figured out and is very capable. So just that whole dynamic of the Kents and Clark, that relationship, like I said, they're present, but that parental role is not yet in place the way we'll come to know it later.
It's true.
And then my last big takeaway, and you were hitting on this a moment ago, is how quaint and small scale these stories are.
Yeah.
Again, very different than the more sci-fi feel that we'll get, especially as we get into the Silver Age of comics. But, these early stories, one of them, for example, deals with a poor kid in class who has patched pants. This was one of the ones in that hardcover. I didn't ask you to read this, but he keeps getting called out for having patched pants. So he's this poor kid in class, and the other kids are making fun of him. And of course, Clark is kind to him and imparting the lesson to the audience, right, that you shouldn't judge other people based on their socioeconomic status. And this kid, kind of his one bright spot in his life at the moment is he's planning to compete in this derby race, and he's building his car. But then while he's practicing, he has an accident, and Superboy has to swoop in and save him, but the car is destroyed. So Superboy builds him a new car, and he's able to enter the race. But during the race, a wheel pops off. And once again, Superboy's there and patches him up. This patches, there you go. And gets him back on the road, and he wins the race. And that's the story. And that is, I would say, particularly in this early stretch, representative of the kinds of stories that we're talking about here. So, like I said, things that stood out, that was definitely one of them. Just the kind of the scope and the tone of these stories. Very, very quaint, very small scale, small town stories.
It makes you wonder, like going back and thinking about comics at the time, they were looked at as children's books, and we hadn't really grown as much as that adult market. So you're thinking, are teenagers kind of reading Superman, and then like we're trying to shoot for like the 8, 9, 10-year-olds, with Superboy, something they can relate to and make it, like you said, more quaint stuff that they might deal with at school kind of thing, and just trying to build that readership. I mean, it's kind of like the equivalent of like those, those level books that you can get that has like the Super Friends, and it's like these small type stories. I kind of equate these Superboy stories to kind of that, because they weren't publishing like Superman Golden books or anything. You could just get the Superboy comic to kind of get the same vibe.
One other piece, when we go back to this idea of the trappings of the legend that aren't yet in place, and this actually points to a question we had from one of our patrons, Brian Dempsey, who asked, what is the earliest issue in these Superboy stories where the glasses show up? Because as Brian pointed out earlier in his message, young Clark doesn't wear glasses in these first few stories. And so I flipped through that hardcover. I was like, when do they pop up? And they pop up in the 7th outing in More Fun Comics number 107. So the last appearance of Superboy in the pages of More Fun Comics before he jumps over to Adventure Comics. So in those first 6 stories, when he's Clark Kent, no glasses. And then they show up in the last one, and there's no accounting for it. It's not like, oh, he realizes he needs to wear a disguise. You have to wonder if behind the scenes, whether from the writer or the editor, someone at some point was like, oh yeah, he should probably be wearing the glasses.
It is true. They're just like, yeah. I mean, because you are just playing Clark as Superboy, so it's not like you can be like, oh, he'll grow into him and be, the glasses as Superman. That's not going to happen. So,
yeah. And this young Clark Kent, not only is he sans glasses at the beginning, but there's an early issue where he is playing pirates with his buddies, and they've made this makeshift pirate ship with a little raft and a bed sheet that they've strung up, and they're pretending to be pirates, and Clark is the captain. And then, of course, 2 escaped convicts from the prison nearby stumble upon them and seemingly shoot Clark, but of course Clark is all right, and they take over this raft, and then Superboy has to save them. But again, he's got his group of friends, not necessarily a consistent group of friends over the issues, but like he's got his buddies. They're playing pirates. He's the captain. In another story, he's the editor of the school paper. So nice. This is not, by the time we get to, honestly, even by the time we get to Superboy number 10, one of the stories that we took a look at where Lana is introduced, there we're into Clark with the glasses, and he's pretending to be timid to throw off suspicion that he's Superboy. So relatively early on here, we'll get into that more familiar territory, but at the outset, not that at all.
I have to ask, out there, because it is a little harder, because which one of the stories were all written by Jerry Siegel? Because he came back later to write Superboy, but had to write under a pen name later on down the, in the 50s, maybe 60s. He was working there, and he was writing Superboy under a pen name. It couldn't be under his name. And he wrote the first few Superboy stories, because as we'll look, the one with Lana is written by another legend. So it makes me kind of wonder, going back and looking at Action Comics number 1 and the way Clark was, and also just, knowing the history of Jerry himself, what he did in high school and stuff, is he putting himself more as a wish fulfillment in Superboy than what they disguise Clark to be later on?
That is an interesting question.
And then you get, say, the new writers coming on who are then taking the Superboy and making it the Clark we know, but as a child.
Gotcha.
Just a theory. Just throwing it out there.
So More Fun Comics number 101, The Origin of Superboy, released at the end of 1944, cover dated 1945. And it's a 5-pager that gives us the origin, the answers to all of the questions that readers have had about what Superman was like when he was a boy, before he grew to man's estate, as they say. Now, here on Digging for Kryptonite, we did an episode on the evolution of the origin across time and media quite a while ago. So if anyone's looking for really more of a deep dive into that, I encourage you to seek out that episode. But sort of where this falls at this point in time, late 44, early 45, of course, we've had the 1-page origin in Action number 1. then the 2-page origin in Superman #1 a year later. And we've also had tellings of the origin on the radio show in 1940, in the Fleischer animated theatrical shorts in 41, and in the George Lothar novel, The Adventures of Superman, in 1942, all with varying degrees of consistency and specificity with respect to each of the beats within the origin story. But then we have more fun comics in at the end of 1944. Let me toss it to you first. I mean, what stands out to you about this?
When it shows him as a boy, really, like carrying the wood, jumping over the barn, chasing the deer, and then of course the pseudo shout out to Action Comics #1 with him stopping the car. Like, that's all the Superboy of it. You know, the rest of it's about the same beats.
Yeah. And when I rattled off those other tellings, I mistakenly left off the newspaper strip, especially from 1939. Yeah. So I would say that the newspaper strip and the George Lothar novel, those were the ones that I think really fleshed out a lot, particularly with respect to the Krypton piece. Mm-hmm. And with the Lothar novel in particular, the idea really of Clark's upbringing, and that story names his Earth parents as Eben and Sarah, and details a bit of that upbringing on the farm. So again, there were pieces of the origin that were fleshed out in other media subsequent to those original tellings in the comics, but specifically talking about the comic book tellings, this is only the third one. And one of the things that's interesting here, and we have spent time on the podcast talking about this, of how Kal-El ultimately ends up in the care of the Kents. Because yes, this is overly convoluted for no reason. I'll run it down real quick. So in Action 1, the baby is found by a passing motorist and brought to an orphanage. And that's it. So purely going by Action Comics #1, Clark seemingly grows up in an orphanage and then becomes Superman. In Superman #1, where we have this expansion from 1 to 2 pages, now we have the Kents, and only Mary is named here. But we have the Kents finding the baby, bringing him to an orphanage, and then going back to the orphanage to adopt him. And then, very interestingly, and I was so struck by this in More Fun Comics, in the Superboy iteration, I can't help but wonder, was this an attempt to sort of reconcile the discrepancy in the previous stories? Because here we have the motorist who brings the baby to the orphanage, and then the Kents come and adopt him. So it seems to be this amalgam of Action 1, where it's just the motorist, and Superman #1, where it's just the Kents.
I do think it's funny because, it says a passing motorist found the child and took it to a foundling home. As the baby grew,
I hope it's not a fondling home.
Yeah. I was like, wait, Tyler. He he astonished members of the home staff by his feats of strength. If I was running an orphanage and a child was lifting a chair like that, that kid's not getting adopted. You know what I'm saying? Like, then it's like, he was later the infant was adopted by a childless couple named Kent.
Yeah.
So it is just interesting. Like, you have these multiple steps, like you said, and then some point in time, we're like, you know what? We're just going to make the Kents the motorists that found him and kept him. We're going to cut out the orphanage. We're going to cut out these extra steps and beats and just kind of make it a little bit more intense.
Yes, and I think especially when you look at the other media adaptations that we're all familiar with and that you and I both talked about on our podcast, I think there is something genuinely compelling and emotional about the Kents finding the baby. And we've seen that play out in a number of different iterations. I think if you have a third party finding the baby and then the Kents come in later, it loses a bit of its impact. But I just can't help but wonder if that little bit was an attempt to try to reconcile those previous versions, because it's weird to me that, and I know we're really overanalyzing this, but it's just so weird to me that the motorist is kind of brought back into the story, where it seems like even as early as Superman #1. We were done with the motorist, right? It's the Kents. But the thing that strikes me even more is the diminished role of the Kents in the Superboy origin story. Because in Superman #1, and again, we're only talking about a couple of pages here, so such limited real estate to get the point across, but the story does it. There's a panel at the bottom of the first page about the importance of the influence of the Kents in instilling these values. And there's this exchange between young Clark and his parents where Pa is talking about how people will be scared of you. You have to keep your strength a secret until the time is right. And you have Ma saying, but essentially when the time is right, we want you to use this to be a force for good. And then at the end of that 2-pager in Superman #1, you have Clark at the grave site of his parents and the narration that, okay, now he's ready to take this next step and he becomes Superman. So in terms of the message they convey to him and then their death signaling the end of that time and the beginning of the next stage of his journey, that's all there, even in just those couple of pages. Here, where I feel like you would expect to see more of them, he's just springing into action, saving that guy who's trapped under the car, like you said, in presumably an homage to action #1. But in any event, this guy's trying to change a tire or whatnot, and the car collapses on him. And as Clark, he lifts it, and then he's got to make up an excuse to the people who see him. He's like, oh, I just had a momentary surge of strength. And he goes home, and he's like, well, I need some kind of disguise. And he just whips up a costume, and he's Superboy, and that's it. It was just interesting to me.
You're like, I need more story. I need more depth. I need more meaning. I need to know why. Why is he doing this?
Well, it makes yes and no. Here's the thing. Yes and no. Yes, from the modern mindset and the guy who loves the Smallville TV show to death and the post-crisis era and all that. Yes. However, I can even put that aside. And to be clear, and I'm glad you said that, because to be clear, I'm really just more surprised strictly in the context of what we've seen so far in the Golden Age, because it just feels like the importance of the Kents in his upbringing was already established in Superman #1. And then here, like I said, they just seem to be kind of pushed to the side, and young Clark is doing this all on his own. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network.
Hello, I'm Daniel Cohen, former film editor of thepopbreak.com, and I've got a Batman podcast for you. We discuss Batman's past, present, and future, and do a lot of rankings episodes. Yes, we rank the movies, villains, but that's not all. We even ranked all the Batman movie trailers throughout history. Yes, we ranked Batman trailers. I dare you to find another Batman podcast that did that. So join me and frequent hosts Alex Marcus and Bill Bakken, as well as a plethora of Bat guests, as we discuss Batman and plenty of DC on film as well. Also, fair warning, I'm a BVS fan, but don't let that scare you away. Trust me, I get mocked and ridiculed more than the Martha line for taking that stance. So relax and tune in on the last Tuesday of every month on the Pop Break Today feed.
This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Many of you have already used this code, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And the next story on our list was Adventure Comics number 120 from 1947, written by Don Cameron, drawn by Al Wenzel. And this is the Perry White Cub Reporter story. Now, I think it is notable. It's the first instance of revealing a previously unknown early encounter between Superboy and a member of the supporting cast who we know from his adult stories, in this case, Perry White. What were your impressions of this one?
I thought it was neat. I actually really like this one because the introduction to Perry White, and I'm trying to get a grasp on how much older Perry is than Clark, and the fact we go down and not jumping to the end, but he's like, "Hey, what's your name?" And he's like, "You won't remember," and Clark just working as a newspaper boy, and then at the same time, as much as I'm enjoying this, I think to myself, wait, this is Metropolis. Why is Clark in Metropolis? Like, is it a summer job? Like,
No, because early on, Smallville was not established yet. In these early stories, it's not really said where he is. And if anything, whenever we're given an indication of where he is, it's Metropolis, or seemingly maybe a suburb of Metropolis. But that's where they are. But yeah, at the outset of this, you have a young Perry White. I would say early 20s. I don't think he's younger than that.
He's got to be at least a good 10 years over Clark.
Yeah, so Clark's 10, right? And you've got,
I would say Perry's 20, 21. I don't know. I like the idea he's young, but he's got to be older. Like he can't be too close to Clark's age.
Yeah, they do. It is a bit close, I would say here, but they're both interviewing for a job with the managing editor at the Daily Planet, who's just biting everyone's head off, and in particular gives Perry a hard time. But young Clark very quickly gets the job of newsboy,
that makes sense.
Perry is quite struck by. And essentially there's this ringmaster, criminal mastermind who's afoot in Metropolis and is utilizing circus performers to commit these robberies. And no one can figure out who he is or find him. And I believe that's essentially what the managing editor says to Perry. Like, if you figure this out, like I'll give you the job. But it seems like an impossible task, right?
It is. And I'm looking here, and one thing I like about this is I find it so interesting that Perry's in this green suit, and the color green doesn't really represent anybody else in it, just because, in old comics, green a lot of time was used for the villains. So for Perry to be in this bright green suit, I think it's just interesting.
Right. Well, and Clark correctly surmises that the ringmaster craves publicity. So after the ringmaster commits another one of these robberies and gets away, and another story is written and new papers are printed, Clark, the newsboy, gives Perry a bundle of them and essentially just sends him out. I feel like it was a little nebulous about how specifically they planned this, because the idea is he's going out and extra, read all about the ringmaster, but he's doing it at an amusement park. So I don't know, did they off panel kind of correctly guess that that's where the ringmaster would be holed up? Presumably.
Yeah. I mean, they're like, hey, they're circus performers. Let's go to the circus.
Right. And so, of course, they stumble upon the ringmaster and the crew, and Perry's initially nabbed. And then, of course, Superboy comes in and rescues him. Perry gets the job. And you, as you said a moment ago, in the last panel there, he essentially says to Clark, hey, I owe you one. I'll get you a job one day. What's your name? And Clark's like, oh, you won't remember it anyway. Which,
he's almost winking back at us, like a very, like George Reeves thing. Like, you won't remember anyway.
Yeah, it definitely has that vibe. And I guess to their credit, in a way, that was a clever way of doing it, because it avoids a bit of a continuity glitch there, right? If Perry never even got this young kid's name.
Yeah, I mean, he might forget and just, over time. But the Superboy element of it, kind of throws it a little too. Like, I did one time meet Superboy, and now there's Superman. But
no, go ahead.
I was saying my favorite part here is when he's arguing with Mr. Hobbs. He's like, but Superboy was there. Ask him. It's true. And he goes, we deal in facts, not fiction. Ask Superboy. Ha, ha, ha. And then Superboy shows up. And then the next panel is him shaking Perry's hand like, welcome to the staff, White. I knew you had it.
Yeah. Well, but you bring up a very, going to be the elephant in the room with all of this, which is that Superboy himself, right, is such a massive retcon. Like, clearly in those original stories, Clark becomes Superman. So now you have this whole other added layer. I mean, is this comics' earliest retcon? I don't know.
But, people didn't look at stories like that as much. Like,
right.
I even think about, we look back at early myths where little things like, you had the Iliad and the Odyssey. there's little consistencies and differences there, but you just kind of, you didn't analyze the story. We didn't pick it apart. We didn't, they just took the story like, okay, this is the story and that's it. Continuity wasn't what it's become.
Yeah, no, very true. I obviously I can't help but think about the echoes of these stories in subsequent comic issues or other media. And of course, if we're talking about a pre-Superman meeting between Clark and Perry, of course, I go to the Perry episode of the Smallville television series. And what's so funny about this is I could be totally wrong. I genuinely doubt that the writers of Smallville had this comic in mind in any way, shape, or form. But even still, the most fundamental beats, right, are present in both stories where they have this early meeting and Perry is in some kind of need. It's very different on the Smallville TV show where he's drinking and he's really down on his luck and he's washed up and all of that. Here, it's a young Perry who's an up-and-comer, but still, he's not where he wants to be and he needs that help. And Clark gives it to him. And both stories end with, hey, I owe you one. I'll get you a job one day. So it was just interesting.
It makes you wonder. And, we kind of hope, like in the back of our minds, we're like, oh, maybe they did, because I know, I guess if I was a writer on the show, I would kind of do that. Like, well, what was, just the kind of, what kind of Easter eggs and stuff callbacks can I pull out that aren't just from like another movie or show? Those are the easy ones, but the deep comic ones are a little bit harder.
Sure. But the next one on our list, and we're moving ahead in time here. So now we're into 1950 with Superboy number 10, written by Bill Finger, drawn by John Cicala. And this is, again, the story that introduces Lana Lang. Now, I have to read the little blurb that opens the issue because I think this kind of says it all as far as what the take on Lana is and just what the overall vibe is of this story. So the issue begins with, one of Superman's biggest headaches today is Lois Lane, the girl reporter who always gets in his way, threatening to find out and reveal his secret identity as Clark Kent. But don't think that, as a youth, Superboy didn't have the same problem. Yes, this little lass with a fatal curiosity is as pretty as Lois Lane, as inquisitive as Lois Lane, as harassing as Lois Lane, and even has the same initials as Lois Lane. She's Lana Lang, young Clark's next-door neighbor, who manages to get in the Boy of Steel's hair wherever he turns, and whom you will get to know as the girl in Superboy's life.
You look above the art right there and see look at the street sign. What does it say?
Yeah, Lane Street.
I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, first Lana.
I liked that this was written by Bill Finger, first of all. Because you can kind of tell the different style. But yeah, it is kind of, are we just cutting and pasting Lois basically? We're like, we need a kid version of Lois, but we can't make it Lois. So we'll make this version. Lana. I'll name her Lana. Okay. Can't make her Lane. We'll make her Lang. It's just,
yeah, I think that definitely jumps out. And the other piece of it is, look, we recognize these were stories of a different era. So I don't want to sit here in 2024 and judge per se, but the inherent misogyny in this story, and that we've seen in others with Lois as well, of just this notion of, she's always in my hair. She's so annoying. And this actually came up just a few episodes ago when we were looking at the first meetings of Batman and Superman. Mm-hmm. And that first story on the cruise ship where Superman has this whole conversation with Batman. He's like, oh, Lois is here. Like, she's not going to let us carry on our investigation. She'll just get in. This getting in our hair phrase comes up a lot. Like, seems to be in this era, like the general vibe here about these ladies in his life.
I agree. Can I go on a small little tangent here?
Sure.
Okay. So this is one thing that bugs me just because of my professional life and everything is in Superboy 1, he was adopted by the kids. In the first panel on the second page, it says, one morning as young Clark Kent, who is secretly Superboy, helps his foster mother. with home cleaning. I don't like when the kids get referred to as foster parents. I work in child protective services, so anybody listening, there's a big distinctiveness between an adoptive parent, their role as just the parent, but also the legality of it compared to a foster parent. You know, foster is usually a time of short term as things are happening with the real parents, and adoption is more of a solidified long term, agreement. So it's one of those things that just that gets me when they'll say Clark with his foster parents. And so that's my little nitpick right there.
Yeah, no, I hear you. They are definitely two distinct situations, and I don't know if the reference here was just an oversight or a lack of understanding or what. But no, I
very
totally
much
get what
could
you're
be.
saying. But so here we meet Lana, this nosy girl next door, when she and Clark are out on the street, and then this fire breaks out at the Smallville Museum, which is interesting to me. It's like this little town. They've got
I know.
museum.
This is the Smallville junkyard, the museum.
Yeah.
And it does say Smallville, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that I double checked. And again, Smallville had been established in Superboy #2. So here we are 8 issues later. So yeah, it's the Smallville Museum. Fire breaks out. And of course, Clark has to pretend to be afraid in order to shake Lana so that he can change into Superboy and put out the fire. And we get into the business of this episode where someone, AKA the man who hates Smallville for having been imprisoned, because this is the message that he leaves, is targeting public buildings across town. And the police question people who have recently been released from prison. And there's one guy who doesn't have an alibi that's verifiable. He claims he was sleeping home alone. And the rest of the townspeople quickly suspect him. And the one who's really seems to be leading the charge is this Mr. Keener, this real estate developer, who's really quick to point the finger at this other guy. Audience, you might be shocked to learn that the real estate developer is actually the one who's targeting all of these public buildings, because if all of the property records are destroyed, then he'll be able to gobble up the land. Look, if you're in Superman territory, you're never far from a real estate scheme. It's really a running theme throughout the mythology here. You gotta love it. You gotta go with it, and you gotta love it.
Well, you did say this is Smallville, and it is worth pointing out. Like, if you just go to that same page when Lana shows up and is pointing, they're in a neighborhood.
Yes,
they're not on the Kent family farm, and there's more to that as we'll learn here soon. They're in a neighborhood, and I just find that fascinating. But I will say I'm actually a really big fan of Clark in the yellow sweater. I like it. Because usually, they like when he's Clark later, he's in a blue suit with a red tie.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point we're in that more familiar territory when we think of this Clark as Superboy era, the look and the behavior, the demeanor. I think we're in much more familiar territory. And so while all of this is going on with them trying to figure out who's destroying these various, there's one point where the wall on one of the buildings is weakened and it like falls into the river.
Yeah. I didn't know how that worked.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm
no architect, but I don't know.
I'm trying to figure out where it is. Oh, here it is.
But,
yeah, the building is shifting into the river, and he like catches the building, moves it back.
As one does. No, but now while all of this is going on, Lana is staying with the Kents because her father, the archaeologist, he and the mother, they're going, I guess she's an archaeologist too, isn't that right?
I mean, our archaeologists are known for living in small towns,
Yes, but they're off overseas collecting animals. And
where's the phrase like rare wild animals? Like,
yeah,
it was very specific. They wanted us to know.
And they ask if Lana can stay with the Kents, and they agree. But of course, now she's really in his hair because she has now come to suspect that he's Superboy. I mean, not helping matters is Ma Kent, who the first morning that Lana's there, she's like, "Oh, Clark, you have to leave for school in 2 minutes. Can you chop all this wood for me?" And Lana's like, "What?" And so like Clark races downstairs and uses his super speed and like rigs up this whole contraption with multiple saws and tries to convince Lana like, oh no, I set this up and it's electrical, and then they're all just chopping the wood at once. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like good job, Ma.
I get it. It's fine. I don't want to nitpick here. But I have a hard time buying that Martha would be that, would be that, kind of absent-minded with a secret that important. So throughout the issue, there are all these instances where, Lana is always trying to test him. And at the end of the story here, she stamps Superboy's hand, right? Convinced that, okay, when I see Clark later, he's going to have this stamp and I'll get him. And then Superboy very cleverly decides to turn that into an opportunity to create the Superboy Club or whatever it is he calls it, and rounds up all the young lads in town and stamps their hands. And so when Clark shows up with the stamp, he's able to explain to Lana, no, it's not just me. All the boys in Smallville have one.
This isn't just a gag meant to make this into a permanent club for any boy who wants to better the community.
Right. And I think, though, my favorite part about this issue is where Superboy's like, I got to get her out of my hair. So he goes to Africa, wherever the Langs are, and he rounds up the animals for them so that they can come home early. But then it backfires because they're so successful that they're going to be sent on all these other missions. So they say to the kids, oh, can Lana stay with you next time? So I just thought that was a funny little kicker to this.
Oh, what have I done to deserve this?
Yeah, which again feels very much like a story, right, in keeping from this era. The one thing that I know I brought this up, and I'll continue to bring this up, but it's always curious to me that people suspect that Superboy even has a secret identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's a concept that was created kind of from pulp literature. I mean, even if you think these characters exist in a world that's similar to ours, they wouldn't probably have like the Shadow, the Phantom, Zorro, these type of proto comic book hero characters. Even Robin Hood. Okay, let's go back to like more mythology, and Robin Hood's a perfect example. He was Robin of Locksley, like he was Robin Hood. Like he didn't really have a secret identity. That's something that later tellings of the story tried to incorporate for him. But so the fact that people be like, Superboy has a secret identity, it's just kind of like, would they really think that, or just think he's Superboy?
Right.
Or all the time.
Even if they surmise correctly, right? Because they know he's not flying around 24/7. Even if they gather, okay, he goes somewhere, he stays someplace. There's a difference between that and, he's walking among us, hiding who he is, and we don't know. And again, I know it's part and parcel with all these stories, and we accept it, but it's just, I don't know. It's just always interesting. It feels like a bit of a leap. Now, the last story on our list here is the Super Dog from Krypton from Adventure Comics number 210 in 1955 by a pair of very legendary, very well-known Superman creators, right?
Mm-hmm. Is it by who did write this one?
So Otto Binder and Kurt Swan.
Yeah, I was like, wait a minute. I was just looking for the names, but it wasn't showing me.
Now, this is an interesting one because when I originally mapped out this run of episodes, I originally grouped the Super Dog from Krypton in with the Silver Age issues because I always consider Krypto such a staple of the Silver Age of comics. But looking at the actual release dates, this was 1955, and generally speaking, we've come to accept Adventure Comics number 247 in 1958, which introduced the Legion of Superheroes as kind of the start of the Silver Age in Superboy land. So this ultimately is a golden age story.
The way that, it is that end of the golden age going into the Silver Age, that transitional story. But I think kind of based on how this book ends, I think that kind of leads to why you would think that it's a more Silver Age, not jumping to the end. Crypto leaves Earth.
Yeah.
It really is kind of a one and done type story, which is very weird. The why you would even introduce this character and this concept for it to be a one and done kind of thing. And then later he would come back. And that's really, I think, why we think of the Silver Age is because that's really where he took flight, so to speak, and really the character became its own thing and did more.
Well, in the Super Dog from Krypton, we open on the Smallville dog catcher making his rounds and rounding up the stray dogs in town, including the dog we'll come to learn is Krypto, who just smashes a hole through the wall of the truck and makes his way into town and helps stop a robbery at the Kent's general store.
The Kent's what? Like, what? We hadn't brought that up yet.
Yeah.
That they're not, like I said, they're in town, not on a farm. They're running a general store.
I know. And that's kind of one of those other things as far as just, things that are striking. I mean, this wasn't so surprising per se, because I knew this was a part of the pre-crisis iteration, but yeah, post-crisis forward, right? I mean, we always think of them as being on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're reading all these stories and they're in town, right? They're living in the neighborhood. Lana's next door and yeah, they have the store. So I know it does take a minute, I think, to kind of acclimate to that. But anyway, Superboy is chasing after Krypto, and Krypto is smart enough to sense that Superboy is confused. He has questions. So Krypto leads him to the ship that had recently crashed. And then there's this note from Jor-El, and Superboy is able to piece together that this dog is from Krypton, that they had tested their spacecraft on animals. And that's how Krypto ended up in space and presumably was hit by a meteor and thrown off course and arrived, now as opposed to earlier. And so Superboy crafts this, stone doghouse for him, and trying to keep him away because of the destructive potential of this dog in town. One of the things that I was so struck by was he brushes him with barbed wire and gives him a lava bath. It's like, again, I guess it makes sense. But
I had to laugh when he shows Krypto wagging his tail and he busts rock, and then he takes the same kind of rock to build the house. He's kind of like, okay. I know.
Well, even when he chains him up, he like Superboy has a line of like, I know this won't hold him, right? But he leaves him enough stuff to, I don't know, was it bones or whatnot? Like, he leaves him enough stuff to try to keep him occupied.
I do think it's funny because the bottom panel is, I forced him a collar or chain too. Of course, he could snap them easily, but those old bones I collected ought to keep him happy for a while. That's the last panel, right? Then you flip it over and it's him giving him the barbed wire lava bath. Then the next panel is him back in the doghouse. It just kind of feels like those two panels should have been flipped.
I know. But of course, he comes to town. He is able to track down Clark. His secret identity be damned.
He says his X-ray vision easily saw the costume under my everyday clothing.
Exactly. And, he tears a beam off of a bridge and brings it to Superboy to play fetch with. So it's, again, everything that Superboy was trying to guard against. Again, this destructive capability of the dog kind of brought to bear now in town. And like you said, it ultimately ends with Krypto departing for space. Like, space is his backyard, as Superboy says, which I had not read this issue before. And my Krypto reading generally, I would say, is on the limited side. But so I was surprised. I kind of in my head, I was like, oh, like he shows up and then he's there. But no, not the case.
Right. Lana shows up and sees Clark carrying this beam and is trying to figure it out. And so we have a continuation of kind of the Lana story that we had in the last one, where she's, in his hair. And then later he shows up with a magnesium ladder. He shows her how light it is. And that's what he had in his hands earlier. And then, of course, he makes a boomerang that he throws that Krypto chases, and he puts his suit on Krypto so that Lana will see it. So she'll stop thinking that Clark is Superboy. And then, like we said, Krypto flies off into space. And it is just weird because you introduce this character like this, and then you're like, he's just off in space. We don't need him anymore.
Yeah, it was like I said, it was clearly you and I were surprised by him, but Krypto will be back. But this is the first appearance. So again, in looking at this just quartet of stories, I think four significant ones: the origin, introducing Lana, introducing Krypto, and what I like about this spread of episodes is we go from 44 to 47 to 50 to 55. So even in just this less than a handful of comics, we've spanned essentially Superboy in the golden age of comics. And, next time around, we'll be looking at Superboy in the Silver Age.
I look forward to your discussion on Superboy in the Silver Age because in a lot of ways, I think Superboy just feels like a Silver Age character. Even though he starts in the Golden Age, it just feels like that's when I think of Superboy. I think of him more, much like we talked about with Crypto and stuff. I think of him more in the Silver Age than I do the Golden Age.
I think most probably do, to be perfectly honest. It's one of these things where I know that, the concept of Clark as Superboy, I know that has its fans, but even among those fans, not to paint with a broad brush, but I'd venture to say that the majority of the Clark Superboy fans would probably cite Silver, maybe Bronze Age, but probably Silver Age as their favorite iteration. Like if there's anyone out there who's like a diehard Golden Age Superboy fan, I would be very curious to hear from you because I do feel like that's probably overlooked a good bit. It's probably once you head into that Silver Age territory that feels most like what we think of when we think of Superboy. But
because we all a lot of times we think Superboy with the Legion, and that doesn't come till the Silver Age.
Yeah. So, in all of these stories that we're looking at, there's no Legion yet. We're not into those, like we said before, those more sci-fi plots that we'll get to in subsequent stories. We're really dealing with things, again, much more grounded, really, like we said, with that small town flavor here. Tyler, I thank you for taking the time. I encourage everyone to check out your podcast, Krypton Report, available on all major podcast platforms and on social media as well. Anything in particular you want to plug or direct people to?
Just find it, like you said, just find us wherever podcasts are going. We try to keep up with news and what's going on, and also focusing on, shows. And I also do like a secondary podcast with some friends called the Electric Mullet, where we are starting with Man of Steel and we're just going through the comics into the 90s and everything. And that's been kind of fun and eye-opening as well, of just things that we take for granted in the story and in the myth that we chalk things up to, that we really start to dissect. You're like, there's always little bits that just don't quite work and line up in a nice continuity like we wish it did.
Yeah, right on. Well, I encourage everyone to check that out. Tyler, thank you again for taking part. Audience, I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next time. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.